Please permit me to begin by extending the warmest wishes of the United Nations to each of you and to all British Columbians. I wish also to thank Glenn Brown and Wally Wells for their kind invitation to speak at this conference, and especially for their patience during this difficult summer when climate and weather circumstances in the Northern Hemisphere made it so very difficult for me to commit as fully and completely to your excellent ongoing efforts to put true sustainability within the grasp of all British Columbians. And it's only out of great urgency related to what happened in the Northern Hemisphere this summer and what it may mean to the global climate that I'm unable to be at your conference in person. Glenn Brown has invited me to explain these circumstances in the context of your proceedings. Not surprisingly, my story begins with a definition of sustainable development that is the foundation of your work and a focus of your professional lives. Sustainable development has been defined in many ways, but most frequently quoted definition is from Our Common Future, also known as the Brundtland Report. Sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And you know all about this. You live it every day. The British Columbia Framework for Asset Management defines sustainable service delivery as that which ensures a current community services are delivered in a socially, economically, and environmentally responsible manner, which is to say a manner that does not compromise the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Okay, that's a foundation, but then you make an astonishing step forward by noting that communities build and maintain infrastructure, not for the sake of infrastructure itself, not because we simply need to employ engineers, but to provide services that support the quality of life of British Columbians, protect their health and safety, promote social, economic, and also environmental well-being. Critically, the framework also observes that if you fail to care for your infrastructure, manage your natural resources, and protect the benefits provided by nature, you risk degrading or even losing the services communities enjoy and upon which future generations will rely upon to meet their needs. I'm here to tell you that I believe your framework is sound, but I'm also of the view that your commitment to that framework and what it actually demands is going to be more severely tested than many of you may have imagined. I suspect, however, some of you already got wind of that this summer. I'm hoping that by explaining what happened this summer, that I will underscore the need to push even more rapidly forward than you've been doing in the direction of natural capital accounting and ecological and earth system restoration as a foundation of community building in British Columbia. The premise of my work at the moment is the following. I have been working for weeks to massage the hardening knot in my chest created by what we saw in terms of accelerating climate disruption throughout the entire Northern Hemisphere this summer. I'm trying to massage that knot into words that describe my anxiety, and then to turn those words in the direction of positive action. After examination of the evidence, I'm of the view that if it isn't already happened now, the heightened anxiety that I and many others are already experiencing personally with respect to the rapid acceleration of climate disruption we are witnessing is about to become a part of the human condition. We will, all of us, to some extent, permanently share my anxiety and the anxiety that many of you felt this summer as week after week we were unable to leave the smoky room of a rapidly changing climate. Rather than despairing about it, we need to put this anxiety to work for us and for the future of humanity. And we do that by urgently focusing on restoring natural system function and resilience where we have the most power to affect change, and that is in the world immediately around us. Success in creating a livable and prosperous future in a radically changed and far more dangerous climate will be defined by the extent that leaders like yourselves and selfless citizens at every level of society are able to keep the world stable while at the same time use their power and pervasive example to lead our society not just in the direction of protection of natural processes, but toward the imperative of Earth system restoration. We are counting on you and also on subsequent generations to provide that leadership. The first question you might ask is, upon what basis can the claim be made that climate disruption is an immediate threat, enough of a threat to warrant extraordinary efforts far beyond those to which you are presently committed to restore natural system function? The first exhibits I would like to put before the court of your opinion are advances in the attribution of human influence on the intensity, frequency, and duration of extreme weather events globally. Attribution is the exploration of causality with respect to heat and water-related extreme weather events. And while it's been conventional wisdom among scientists for decades that no single extreme weather event could be attributed specifically to climate change, the latest research indicates that that may no longer always be the case. A major report published by the prestigious U.S. Academies of Science in March of 2016 clearly states that the science has advanced to the point where, in certain instances, anthropogenic attribution may now be possible. The principal reason we have been incapable of being able to accurately attribute any given extreme weather event to anthropogenic effects is not because they're not real. It's because our models are still in development or we have limited long-term data. And it's also true that in many cases, we don't even know enough about some forms of extreme weather to make reliable judgments on how much human impact can influence their intensity and duration. Extreme event attribution, however, is a rapidly developing science. From the outset, it's recognized that extreme weather has multiple causes, always. And it's fair to say that generally, we can know a fair amount about extreme heat and cold events, largely because of the quality and length of the observational record. We also know a good deal about droughts and extreme rainfall. We know less, however, about extreme snow and ice storms, and even less about tropical and extratropical storm cycles. Nor are we very good at predicting or assessing the behavior of extreme convection events like tornadoes. But by extending the historical observation record, improving remote sensing, and employing multiple models and studies on specific aspects of weather and climate extremes, we are constantly improving our ability to accurately attribute the impact of human presence and activity on the frequency and intensity of extreme weather events. And depending upon the nature of the event, how questions concerning attribution are framed, and the availability of relevant data, tentative assessments can now be cautiously put forward. Studies conducted under the World Climate Research Program on 35 of the 63 extreme seasonal events between 2001 and 2013 are very important. After 400 model simulations, human influence was clear on all of the heat waves during that period. It was harder, however, to estimate attribution in hydrological events, but with the right data, it can be done. It has been demonstrated, for example, that human impacts on the climate system made the flooding in Colorado in 2013, the same year as the flood disaster in southern Alberta, twice as likely. And it also suggests that it made rainfall 30% more violent. Evidence suggests that human impacts made India's 2015 heat wave 30 times more likely. And because of lost and damaged natural system capacity to absorb the effects of extreme conditions, it was held that human impacts on the climate system made recent heat waves in Pakistan perhaps up to 1,000 times more likely. It is now held that this past sweltering Northern Hemisphere summer would not have been half as likely were it not for human-induced global warming. What we're saying now is that we can sometimes attribute the effects of human impacts on extreme weather events. We must, however, clearly state the conditions, the caveats, and uncertainties. The question is this: what will this mean in terms of liability? We don't know yet, but one thing is certain. There's no better time than after the Northern Hemisphere summer of 2018 to talk about liability with respect to climate disruption. For during that summer, we began to see exactly what inaction is going to continue to cost us, not just economically, but in terms of human duress and suffering if the climate threat is not addressed. And as you know, municipalities in British Columbia are already contemplating class action lawsuits against the world's largest fossil fuel producers to recover damages from yet another devastating province-wide fire season. And I would submit to you that it won't be easy. While the Paris Agreement allows for examination of the risks of damage and displacement with respect to the impacts of climate disruption, it does not allow attribution of blame, suggestions of liability, or recommendations for compensation. It's a big question, however. Who is going to pay? And it's becoming a global issue. The question that might be asked next is how this is playing out elsewhere, particularly among the world's biggest greenhouse emitters. Whenever the conversation turns to national or regional strategies for managing climate-related impacts, while at the same time protecting and bolstering regional natural capital, redesigning cities, and preparing citizens for a very different and much more populated world that we are bringing into existence, the world invariably looks toward China. China is a model for imagining and then creating a sustainable future for all of humanity. Why? Because as China goes, so goes the world. China is the world's biggest emitter of greenhouse gases. The burning of coal is the main reason why China is home to 16 of the world's 20 most polluted cities. Also, according to projections, in 25 years, China will emit 2 times more carbon dioxide than all of the OECD countries combined. China will inherit serious climate change impacts as a result, in part, of their own emissions. In 2004, the total annual cost of environmental decline in China was already estimated to be $111 billion, a staggering 8% of China's GDP even at that time. Gross domestic product, however, can hardly be considered a measure useful in determining the state of environment anywhere. The cost of the rest of the world of China's pollution, inestimable, or is it? In assessing China's progress in the direction of sustainability, it's useful to examine a recent report, China's War on Pollution, What Comes Next, which was released by the International Institute for Sustainable Development in July of 2018. The report correctly acknowledges that what China does is key to the advancement of sustainable development globally. The report observes that China has set ambitious targets aimed at meeting the UN's 2030 Global Sustainable Development Agenda, which includes a strong commitment to the Paris Accord. These actions, the report notes, fall under an evolving concept that China is sharing with the world with the aim of creating what China is calling an ecological civilization. A clear-sighted analysis of the pillars of the ecological civilization promise, however, reveals that the order of China's national priorities has not changed. The three pillars of sustainable development remain economic growth first, social development second, and then improvements in the environment. Why does that matter? The risk our civilization takes in not putting natural system restoration on par with economic growth as a political priority is made very clear in the terms and conditions of the Paris Agreement on climate change, to which most nations of the world, including China, are signatory. The Paris Agreement was constructed in a way that made its central goal to both limit warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius and to pursue efforts to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. It's a given, however, that since the amount of carbon dioxide emitted cannot be exactly known, that the response of the Earth system to human-generated greenhouse emissions cannot be known precisely either. Consequently, temperature change projections are based on probabilities. A fair reading of the Paris Agreement would be that the targets that were agreed upon would have a 66% probability of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius and a 90% probability of not exceeding 2 degrees Celsius. To meet the 2-degree limit of the Paris Agreement, even within the 66% probability range, would require rapid cuts in greenhouse emissions to near zero by 2050. So how close are we to meeting the target of zero emissions? Well, the Comprehensive and Global Paris Agreement is truly an historic milestone. There are no clear penalties for the failure of any country not undertaking its pledged actions. And it's important to note that the negotiations required to arrive at even this level of agreement did not go smoothly. It took from 1992 to 2015 to arrive where we are now. The country pledges, called nationally determined contributions, go nowhere near far enough to achieve the well below the 2 degrees Celsius goal. The gap between promise and practice continues to grow. The emissions gap between the pledges and a 2 degrees Celsius outcome are presently roughly equivalent to the combined emissions of China and the United States in 2017. With President Trump reversing America's commitment to greenhouse gas emissions reductions, this gap is about to get larger. And because greenhouse emissions are increasing globally rather than being reduced, warming to 1.25 degrees or well below 2 degrees is already held to be an unreasonable expectation. According to many climate scientists, we may be looking now at temperatures of 3 degrees or perhaps as high as 4 degrees within the next 75 years, or, suggested by what we saw in the Northern Hemisphere, perhaps even sooner. While it's technologically possible to reduce emissions to near zero, the only way this target can be achieved would be to put the eradication of greenhouse emissions at the same level of importance politically as economic growth. This would suggest that for China to succeed, for any country to succeed, for Canada to succeed, restoration of Earth system stability has to be put at the same level of priority as economic growth. And I don't have to tell you that making restoration of Earth system stability a priority equal to economic growth is not going to be easy anywhere here in Canada. And the more we look into the problem, the more we see the necessity for this balance. Research has revealed new and very interesting findings that suggest that extraordinary efforts to restore natural system function are not only warranted, but maybe our only practical and affordable way forward in the future. What we're discovering is that by degrading landscapes and riparian systems over time, nations and entire regions lose the vital buffering effect provided by intact natural processes, leaving them exposed to the full force of increasing hydroclimatic variability. This suggests that places with limited, lost, or compromised natural absorptive protection from climate impacts are far more directly vulnerable to acceleration of the global water cycle and more subject to climate disasters than places where natural systems are still in place that slow and moderate those effects. And what that means is that countries and regions that have over time allowed natural environments to be degraded or lost are going to be exposed to the full brunt of more powerful, more devastating, and more frequent floods, deeper and more persistent droughts, and in some places, bigger, hotter, and faster wildfires. And it is here that suddenly the damage, and I should say the damage we ourselves doing to the stability of the Earth system, and in particular the impact that is having on the global climate system, becomes very, very relevant. The total cost to the rest of the world of China's environmental degradation and pollution, inestimable? Not anymore. The heat we experienced this summer would not have been half as likely were it not for human-induced global warming. But there's more. Recent research done in British Columbia by its own Pacific Climate Impacts Consortium demonstrates that during the current decade, the combined effect of anthropogenic and natural climate forcing is estimated to have made extreme fire risk events in Western Canada 1.5 to 6 times as likely compared to a climate unaffected by human influence. It should surprise no one, really, that the combined heat generated by the big emitters like China and the United States is now having deadly direct and indirect impacts on neighboring countries whose total emissions are held by them to be relatively inconsequential. Many people in the Northern Hemisphere woke up to that realization this summer. The turning point in our observations was the sunrise over much of Western Canada on the morning of Friday, August 17th, 2018. That sunrise was surprisingly smoky in an almost apocalyptic way. It seemed like a scene right out of a sci-fi or cli-fi doomsday thriller. It had already been a hot and deadly summer across the Northern Hemisphere. You may remember that the summer of 2018 began in Western Canada with a rapid melt of near-record snowpacks in the Mountain West. The rapid melt caused record flooding in parts of British Columbia and exceptionally early and high flows in rivers draining the Canadian Rockies as summer's heat came early. Then came the real heat waves. Japan experienced its highest temperatures on record, 41 degrees in some cities, with humidex readings as high as 48 degrees. Record temperatures killed at least 29 in South Korea. In June, a heat wave in eastern Canada resulted in 93 deaths in Quebec. In Canada again, Calgary recorded its hottest day ever, 37 degrees Celsius on August 10th. Heat was matched by a lack of rain in the Canadian West, with the worst drought in 50 years in parts of the southern prairies. Next came the wildfires and the endless smoke that spread across 5 provinces and 2 territories for weeks on end, breaking all records for smoky days in major cities like Calgary and Edmonton. But this didn't just happen in Canada. The rapidly moving wildfires killed 91 people in Greece in July. At the same time, Europe was fighting wildfires from Portugal to the Swedish tundra north of the Arctic Circle and across the normally soggy Welsh mountains. Australia was fighting unprecedented winter bushfires, and California had at least 8 deaths in its most severe fire season ever, a season that even included a fire tornado. And at the same time, Europeans were simultaneously fighting deadly floods in France and Italy. Meanwhile, Americans were fighting floods in the eastern and upper Midwest states. West Africans were dealing with massive floods, and floods ravaged Colombia and Venezuela. By August, the most severe monsoon rains in over a century killed 400 in India and displaced over 800,000 people from their homes. At the same time, the thickest depth of remaining multi-year Arctic sea ice north of Greenland was melting and breaking up. The impossible seemed to be happening all at once around the world. We knew the threat, but we didn't expect what happened this summer to happen so soon. If you are looking for a smoking gun to confirm climate change, this summer is it. This summer, we concluded that higher mean annual temperatures, especially in northern Canada, are already greatly increasing wildfire risk. 10 years ago, scientists predict a whopping 75 to 120% increase in the amount of area burned each year by the end of the century. This is now happening. We are also seeing once again this year that a slower and wavier jet stream is causing the conditions that exacerbate the wildfire threat to intensify and persist longer in vulnerable places. As a result, fires are already becoming bigger, hotter, and faster, and just as scientists predicted, methane releases have accelerated from the thawing permafrost of the Arctic. We now have forest fires that are fueled by the methane they release. Research has also demonstrated that the megafires can generate enough energy to permit pyrocumulonimbus clouds to pierce the stratosphere and for the ash and debris carried that far aloft to circulate in the planet's upper atmosphere in the same way ash from big volcanoes does, with the same effect, albeit with lesser potential short-term effect on the global climate. We know the effects on our physical health and what that will cost in terms of health care. But what do we know of the mental health impacts of being under a smoky sky for weeks on end, summer after summer? How will people deal with prolonged periods during which they can barely see across the street? Their eyes and throats burn, and the air is hard to breathe. We saw this summer what it is like to live in many parts of China today, where people don't want to go outside, where it's unhealthy to ride your bike or work in your garden, and where outdoor public events are canceled because of poor air quality. For years, climatologists and hydrologists have offered predictions about outcomes of our business as usual approach and put forward alternatives to lead us down a different path to an alternative set of realities. These recommendations have either been ignored or translated into half-hearted policies that pretend but fail to become priorities. But during this summer that wasn't, with its reports of over 560 forest fires burning in BC alone, thousands on evacuation notices, and smoke that could impact most of Western Canada and the northern US well into the late summer, many are now thinking about where we're headed and also about how fast we may get there. Prominent climate scientists are now saying that their worst fears have been realized. The feedbacks they cautiously predicted might further accelerate climate impacts over a longer time span now appear to be kicking in far earlier than expected. Many prominent scientists are saying that 2018 may in fact be a turning point in human history. Several have offered that humanity may have crossed an invisible threshold into a new climate regime, and that now we entered an era of more severe, if not permanent, climate disruption. Look at these numbers. In the last 20 years, 157,000 people have died as a result of floods. And according to the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, between 1995 and 2015, floods affected 2.3 billion people. Droughts, a billion more. Another 600 million were impacted by storms, and another 8 million by wildfire. Recent research has demonstrated that with a mean global temperature rise of 1.5 degrees Celsius, human losses from flooding could rise by 70 to 83%, and direct flood damage increase from 160% to 240%. In a 2 degree Celsius world, the death toll is 50% higher and direct economic damage doubles. Impacts at 3 degrees Celsius are notably harder to model as the extent of variability becomes absolutely staggering. Flood impacts are further shown to have an uneven regional distribution, with the greatest losses observed on the Asian continent at all analyzed warming levels, with commensurate effects, of course, on involuntary human migration. Many will not believe that a threshold of this kind has been crossed because they refuse to comprehend the need or the enormity of this challenge. Many more will not want to believe it, some because it's beyond their intellectual grasp or experience, others because it is in opposition to their strategic monetary interests, ideology, or religious convictions. Conflicted politicians, paid climate change deniers, and skeptics in the employ of covertly weaponized philanthropic organizations masking as legitimate democratic institutions will immediately write these claims off as fake news. They will counter that the Earth has witnessed such changes in climate before, but will refuse to acknowledge that at no time in the Earth's history was the planet occupied by nearly 8 billion people, trapped largely within infrastructure designed for an earlier and less volatile climate regime. Such protestations, however, will not change the facts, nor will they affect the weather. Climate disruption is no longer just a threat to public health. It's not just a threat to local economies, food security, and regional and national political stability. Human and planetary health are linked. Without the latter, the former becomes a moving target. This is a dawning of a completely different kind of day, a day like no other in the history of humanity. This summer, we realized that because we have not taken adequate action to reduce carbon dioxide emissions, we are now facing a pending planetary emergency. If you were in British Columbia, Alberta, the Northwest Territories, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Northern Ontario, or even parts of Atlantic Canada this summer, and you wanted to know what a planetary emergency will look like, all you had to do was look out the window. Canada's not alone. If you were in affected parts of Asia, in Europe, or even in Australia on August 17, 2018, and you wanted to know what climate change will mean to your future, all you had to do was to go outside to see what is to come. Wildfires are happening more often around the world and have come to be as costly to our society as hurricanes and tornadoes. Air quality from fires is now a worldwide issue. It's estimated that 330,000 people globally will lose their lives this year from the after effects of wildfire. Climate science outcomes suggest that we face a long emergency. Now that we've been put on notice, what should we do? There are a number of clear lessons that stand out in terms of wildfire from the summer of 2018. We need to halt watershed degradation, protect and restore full watershed function, and reverse century-old forest management practices that focused on wildfire suppression, resulting in changes in forest dynamics that have led to huge fuel buildup and greater risk of catastrophic fires. We need to restore the power of patchwork forest to limit the intensity of natural fires that we know will always occur. We have to stop building in fire-prone areas. We have to fire-smart communities already surrounded by forests, establish wildfire corridors, and support systemic prescribed burning programs. We need to see wildfire as an integral part of a healthy forest and include that realization within an unrelenting commitment to a restoration imperative embraced by all. But we also have to understand that it's not just the future of our forests that should concern us. In our view, climate warming is now a permanently lit match held over not just the forests, but the entire geography of the Northern Hemisphere, if not the entire globe. Our estimates that even at 2 degrees Celsius of warming globally, we should expect at least 5 degrees of warming in Canada's western mountains, and much greater warming further north in our boreal forests, and also in the Arctic and on the interior plains. We know also that we're not going to limit warming to 2 degrees. The match is lit, and the only way to extinguish it is to restore balance in Earth system function. It is clear now that we have to respond to the fact that we as a society have passed over an invisible threshold into an era of uncontrolled, and until we do something about it, uncontrollable climate disruption. But we also have to see, and this is so important, we have to see that this is not the end of the world, it's just the beginning of another. It is held that there are 9 Earth system boundaries which must not be crossed if we are to maintain a safe operating space for humanity now and in the future. Scientists have considered that we've already crossed 4 of these boundaries. The disruption of nitrogen and phosphorus cycles, the human-induced alteration of the Earth's climate, deforestation of 3 trillion of the 6 trillion trees that are thought to have existed on Earth before the human era, and the boundary of biodiversity loss. Of the other 5, while we're close, we're not yet at the proposed limits of 3 planetary boundaries, including, remarkably, freshwater use, ocean acidification, and stratospheric ozone depletion. Scientists have not yet agreed on global boundaries for the final 2, atmospheric aerosols, which, as we saw this summer, have both human and ecological impacts, and chemical pollution, including the emergence of new chemical and biological agents that cause genetic damage. From this, we see that the period of being reactive and continuously debating evidence of what we thought would happen if our climate changed must now be over. The hour for grandiloquent but baseless proclamations has passed. We will not survive any more token policies. Denying what anyone will soon see for themselves will unnecessarily inhibit effective action in ways that could quickly transform anxiety into anger and then lead to widespread panic. It is the role of leadership, always, to carefully direct anxiety that could turn into despair to positive action. We have to catch up with and get ahead of this problem and start solving it. And doing so will require courage. But fortunately, we still have room to move. In making a case for a global restoration imperative, let me return again to the Brundtland definition of sustainability and the goal of meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet theirs. I would submit to you that our situation as we witness it this summer is this. In so substantially altering the fundamental composition of the global atmosphere, we have generated effects and impacts that are cascading throughout all of nature. We've literally altered Earth system function to such an extent that if we're not careful now, the world future generations will inherit could be unlike the world any human has ever known, fulfilling the promise of meeting the needs of our generation without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs appears at the moment to be nearly impossible. At this moment in time, there's no guarantee that even we, let alone they, can meet their own needs and these altered conditions, let alone meet the needs of our children. This means that we must first, and to a very real extent, restore the world as we've known it before we can begin fulfilling the terms of Brundtland's definition of what it means to be sustainable. We literally have to go back so we can go forward again. In this regard, water and climate are inseparable. It seems to me sometimes that they are one and the same. The loss of hydroclimatic stability is telling us that true sustainability may be beyond our grasp if we don't do the right thing now. And many believe that out of sheer necessity, we will adapt and become more resilient as a society. At present, however, policy change continues to move at 5 kilometers an hour, while hydroclimatic change just accelerated from 19 to 25 kilometers an hour in just 1 year. We can and we need to do more. We keep talking about adaptation in the service of resilience, but resilience implies protecting what we have now. The dictum that development can be approved on the basis of no new net environmental impact no longer pertains. We need to be presilient. We need to protect what we have, certainly, but more than that, we need to adapt now for what is to come. To be sustainable development in the future must not only be environmentally neutral, it must be also restorative and presilient. We know what we have to do. In order to deal with what we've done to the world, we need to remake our society, and we can do that under a restoration imperative. Such an imperative would demand that we restore memory of who we are and where we came from, restore local identity and humanity's sense of place, restore truth, restore responsibility to human dignity, economic morality, equity and rule and law, and in so doing, restore common purpose. And restore also a vision for humanity and the planet. But most urgently, such an imperative must become an immediately effective vehicle for not just the protection, but for the rapid restoration of critical natural system function so that we can restore balance in the world and step back from the climate crisis. Sooner or later, as climate disruption affects and frightens and kills more people, recognition of the disaster we face will lead to mass demands for immediate change. We must be ready when that happens. Interests behind the climate change denial industry and politicians off on other adventures would have us believe that scaring the public with the threat of climate disruption just frightens and paralyzes people. There is little historical foundation to this argument. One wonders what would have happened if Winston Churchill failed to tell Londoners that the Germans were going to bomb the hell out of their city because he was afraid it would frighten them. Sooner or later, they would have to face the truth. Instead, Churchill told all of Britain what was to come, and they rose to it. Why can't we expect that now? Time and again, average people surprise themselves and the world with their remarkable fortitude, selflessness, and sheer bravery in the most impossible of situations. Can't we give people the credit they deserve for intelligence, resilience, and courage? Don't all people want a secure future? We, all of us, whether we live in China or Canada, now know we share the same global atmosphere. Leaders in both government and business around the world are finally beginning to see that the climate threat is real and that it's necessary and in the interests of the common good to act. It is in the will to action that our hope for the future resides, and along with it, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to create a better world for ourselves and for our children. This is our generation's moment. More than at any other era in human history, this is a time for heroic, committed leadership and relentless citizenship in service of a future in which we not only survive, but flourish. That leadership and that citizenship exists within our communities, but what is missing is a sense of urgency. You live in one of the last places in the world where it's still possible to transcend the climate debate and create a better world. British Columbia is one of the few places on the planet that has enough remaining natural capital to protect and restore its way back to true sustainability. If all of British Columbia focused on restoring and building natural capital, as some communities have already begun to do, you could restore your rivers and lakes, you can restore your forests. We can reverse our effects on phosphorus and nitrogen cycles. In so doing, we can stabilize the climate. We may even be able to stabilize the world. We cannot restore lost biodiversity, but we can halt its decline and consciously direct evolution toward a richer future. We can make where we live and the world better. We can create an ecological civilization. We can make sustainable attainable if we work together. Restore, restore, restore. What you do matters. We can do this. For the sake of our future, I urge you to make restoration part of your leadership imperative. I encourage you to do so throughout this conference and always. Thank you.